poor. And I think it was simply an oversight that we focus so much on global warming and so little on the world's poor. And I think if you were going to be very rude about it, you could possibly say it's also a little bit because we care about our own children. So our own children, we worry, will grow up in a world where it's global warming and it's going to be terrible for them, compared to the world's poor, which are mostly not our kids, it's someone else's kids, typically in Africa or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia. So in some sense, this is really, I'm going to pick my kids over all the other unfortunate kids. I think that was also a big driver. And I try to argue both of these and get people to realize maybe that's not the right priority for our planet.
Okay, I do think that generally speaking, it's best to take people at face value, because to not do so means that you're not extending a hand of trust, and it gets you into a terribly complex cognitive situation. But I would point out that you did question their motives at the end of that answer, saying that perhaps people are more concerned with their own children and willing to sacrifice the world's poor, so to speak, in their prioritization as a consequence of that. I looked at the potential dark motivation of a kind of lurking anti-capitalism. Another possibility, perhaps, is that a lot of the problems that you list do fall into the same conceptual category as the world's poor. The hypothetical person that you described said, well, there'll still be poor people in 2030 and we can worry about them. And so you might say that you can't make poverty into an apocalyptic catastrophe plausibly. And you can't even make tuberculosis into a cataclysmic problem or apocalyptic problem plausibly. We know how that's going to go. It's going to stay pretty much the same way that it is, barring mutation. But with climate change, there's a non-zero possibility of cataclysmic collapse. The Greenland ice pack melts and slides into the ocean, or the Gulf Stream reverses, or something like that, and we get a situation where positive feedback loops spiral out of control, and everything culminates in catastrophe. It might be that we don't know how to deal with a problem that has a non-zero probability of being infinite.
And that is a good that is a good theoretical conversation. My take on that is really twofold. It's partly, I think it's just simply a question of imagination. Everything, when you run it out to 2100, has a non-zero probability of going really, really wrong. So one very good argument would be to say, take HIV/AIDS, which laid bare much of sub-Saharan Africa. If you imagine we did nothing about HIV/AIDS, you could very easily imagine one or more states in Africa collapsing over the 21st century. Throw in some bioterrorism and some geoengineering, some bioengineering, and you can get a catastrophe. That it drives up some terrorists who are going to basically eradicate humanity. You can come up with almost any kind of scenario that will end the world. And clearly, we also have many, many other scenarios that we're not particularly worried about. One would be North Korea. That seems a non-plausible outcome, that they could end up ending the world if we don't do something about North Korea. I'm not sure what that something would be, but the point here is to say that it's very clear we're saying, yeah, we're going to be a little worried about North Korea, but not very much.
Okay, so are you criticizing my hypothesis, or are you pointing? So, because I said that climate change seems to slide pretty easily into an apocalyptic vision, and one interpretation of your criticism would be, well, that's not valid. It's not valid to make it apocalyptic like that, because many other things can be made apocalyptic. But do you think that it's plausible potentially that it is easier to do that with climate change?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not clear why. Maybe it's because it also involves the non-human actors in the world, and people feel additional guilt about that. So do we have a rule of thumb that's something like, well, when we're discussing practical moves forward, we don't get to extrapolate from the present apocalyptically and say that this problem is so severe that it requires an infinite amount of resources, or it morally obligates us to devote an infinite number of resources to its solution. We don't get to play that game.
That was exactly my point. So there's been a wonderful discussion between a Harvard professor who was arguing essentially that point, that global warming might be infinitely bad, so we should be spending infinitely resources on it. And a Yale economics professor, William Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize in climate economics, and his point was exactly to say, look, there are infinities everywhere else. You might have heard Elon Musk is worrying about the fact that AI robots will take over, will possibly take over the world. There's the possibility that nanotech will lead to gray goo taking over the entire world. There's potential lurking catastrophes in everything we do. You can't, and that was Nordhaus's point, you can't just take one and say, oh, I'm going to spend infinity over here, because you should be spending infinity on pretty much everything else. Of course, that doesn't actually compute. And so what real people do all the time is we're faced with things that have a tiny probability of going really, really badly. We spend more resources on them. We try to find more ways to tackle them smartly, but we also recognize there's no way we're going to get rid of all apocalyptic problems. We simply have to be smart about it. And in my book, I talk about how we should also be smart about climate change. If you worry about the apocalyptic prospects of global warming, the only way to fix that is by investigating, not doing, but investigating geoengineering, which is basically a way of being able to, without climate policy, be able to stabilize the planet's climate.
Right, and I don't have the feeling that geoengineering solutions are going to be an easy sell, even to people who are apocalyptically minded. And maybe it's because they envision geoengineering apocalypses as a consequence.
And they do. But what you also have to remember is a lot of people will tell you, I believe global warming is the end of the world. And certainly lots of kids are really, really scared about this. And I think we should come back to talking about how this is just simply not real. But I often find it really surprising that if you really, really, really believe this could be the end of the world, why is it you're not advocating the only technology that we know right now